Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for sticking around, coming to our talk today. As she said, my name is Andrew Kopcienski. I am part of the MCC at Mandiant, the Mandiant Communications Center. My job is really about communicating kind of the most up-to-date information that we have to the right audiences in the right way. Lee Foster will be joining me here in a bit, former colleague, current friend, who is the Senior Vice President at Alethea. He's going to be talking about disinformation in particular, but our talk today is really going to center on election threats. Election security has been kind of an area of critical importance for a long time. Mandiant has been talking about it since before they became Mandiant. We've been looking at these threats for really 10 years or more in some cases, but they really have come to the forefront in the past couple of years. The 2016 election was really the first time that foreign election interference became kind of a big deal on the national stage and in the national conversation. And there's been a lot of confusion about what exactly happened. And since the 2020 presidential election, cyber risks to elections have become this really huge concern across the political spectrum. For Mandiant, when we look at cyber risks, whether it's elections, whether it's critical infrastructure, whatever it may be, we break it down into what is vulnerable and how do we talk about it. That means creating an attack surface. What we have here on this slide is really a breakdown of how Mandiant understands risks to elections. And we really have three major components to the attack surface of elections and kind of democracy as a whole. If we start at the center, that little light blue column, you have kind of the core election infrastructure. So we're talking voting machines, the hardware, the software that goes into them, how that machine runs, who runs the software, how that software gets onto those machines. You also have, in that next section out, you have kind of election administration. That's really kind of the middle section that talks to threats to election commissions, state and local governments, electoral registers. And then broadly, that last and red section deals with threats to election campaigns. And really, that outer section is focused generally on how people talk about elections. We're talking about conversations and understandings on elections and how people influence them. And we'll cover that in more detail later. I want to start really, though, at the core. Cyber risks to the systems kind of right at the core of elections are really much like cyber risks to any other computer network or computer system. You have a lot of people who, when they talk about cyber risk to elections, we've all seen it on the news, you have a picture of someone wearing a hoodie, and we envision someone sitting thousands of miles away in some windowless room conducting some kind of scheme targeting elections on behalf of some shady foreign government. The reality is that the core election infrastructure faces a much more serious threat from other attack vectors. From Mandiant's perspective, we're a lot less worried about somebody compromising election machines than we are about a poll worker dropping their latte on a box of ballots. We do have a lot more to talk about when it comes to this kind of broadly understanding threats to elections, but I want to dig in on this particular section for a minute. What do I mean by understanding threats to the core of election systems? It's no secret that elections are complex. The scale of elections as a system that can be attacked is vast. You have national and regional and state voting systems all the way down to local and county. You have all the individual vendors and suppliers and everyone who sells and maintains and delivers voting machines. You have everyone who administers elections. It's obviously not possible for us to categorically say with 100% confidence that these systems cannot be compromised. What we can say, based on all the historical analysis that we've done, the vast body of work that Mandiant has produced, every understanding that we have from conducting incident responses, looking at incidents that have dealt with these issues, talking to our customers, talking to our contemporaries, our colleagues, our partners, what we can say with moderate confidence is that a large-scale compromise directly impacting votes and directly compromising precisely what we see when it comes to, like, the actual confidence in voting itself, which is really what we talked about, we've been talking about for quite some time. It's something that Kevin and some of his guests had talked about. This kind of attack on confidence is really something that we haven't seen coming from this particular attack landscape. We haven't seen evidence anywhere to suggest that there's been a large-scale compromise that has, in some way, compromised the actual integrity of elections. There just isn't any evidence to support it. What we have seen, though, is that a lot of the threats that have directly threatened elections at this level, at the core infrastructure, come from insiders. Luckily, we aren't the only people who have considered insider risks to elections. CISA, in particular, were the ones who put this particular graphic together, and you can see kind of how they broke this down. There are 4 different categories of insider threats to elections that CISA understands and has been trying to counter. You have them broken down kind of left and right hemisphere into unintentional and intentional. There are negligent and accidental. There are intentional and collusion attacks. From an unintentional attack standpoint from an insider, these are just things that happens in any complicated system. You have people who forget things, who lose things, who break things. We've seen people in all sorts of investigations do all sorts of every possible negligent and accidental thing that broke something at some organization. Elections aren't immune to that. That's something that's going to happen, and we all know it. What we are more concerned about when it comes to elections, this is something Lee will speak on more in depth later, is these intentional insiders who are acting on behalf of some sort of belief or some sort of central core of their identity that causes them to become a malicious risk to elections. And we've broken this down, again, into intentional and collusion. There are a couple of different examples that have come up in the past couple of years that are really good to go over. The first one actually comes from last year. There was a judge in the United States in 2021 that actually ruled that a particular poll worker, someone who had been involved in the administration of elections, was no longer allowed ever again in her life to actually access election systems, mostly because she allowed somebody who wasn't at all verified to come in and take a bunch of pictures and tamper and introduce some unintentional vulnerabilities. We have other examples of threats to elections from malicious insiders as well that came from this year. This one in particular actually wasn't from the US. It was actually an example from the Philippines. There were several individuals who were arrested by Philippine National Police because they had been paid off and bribed to collude to switch votes during an election in favor of one individual candidate. These kind of threats are really where we stand to see a significant amount of risk facing our midterm elections, in the next couple of weeks, and really all elections moving forward. We're very concerned about the prospect of securing the actual process of voting at individual precincts, because there is just so much out there that is driving people to have strong opinions either way about how elections are being run. Before we get to that, though, I want to talk a little bit more about espionage actors targeting this core of election systems, because there's a lot to talk about that we really need to be very specific and careful when we put out exactly what we mean. So there are risks of malicious foreign actors targeting core election systems. That's absolutely real. We know that there are actors out there and groups out there that have tried to target these systems in the past, but they really haven't come to any sort of massive or impactful impact that has been seen in major elections in the past. There's just simply no evidence to suggest that any of these actors, no matter how sophisticated and dangerous they are, and APT 41, APT 31, 29, 42, they are dangerous and they are sophisticated, but they haven't, for whatever reason, whether ability or desire, caused a significant and measurable impact on the integrity of elections here in the US or really anywhere else. We do know that they are going to continue to target them at some point in the future, but these risks really start to become more clear when we start zooming out a little bit more from the core and we start focusing on that second ring of the attack surface. This is an interesting topic because it's not one that gets talked about when we talk about election administration and the support organizations that surround elections and enable elections to actually happen. So in this kind of band of the attack surface, what you have are all of the administrations, all of the individuals, all of the organizations that handle the process of conducting elections here in the US. So we're talking electoral registers, election commissions, state and local governments, all the people who work for those state and local governments, which are targets that we've seen, focused on by malicious actors in the past. In contrast to the core of election systems, when we talk about this outer ring or the middle ring of our attack surface, we absolutely have evidence of actors, malicious actors, and significantly dangerous malicious actors targeting organizations like this. But, and this is again important, the impact remains extraordinarily moderate and mitigated in large part. I want to talk specifically about one of the best examples that has come out of these election organizations and their administrations being targeted by malicious actors. Beginning in May of 2021 and carrying all the way through February of this year, there has been a really interesting campaign that we had been tracking conducted by APT41. For those of you who don't know, APT41 is a really, really interesting threat group. They're pro-Chinese, they come likely acting on behalf of the Chinese government, and one of their interesting factors is that compared to many, many other APT groups, so espionage groups acting on behalf of or at the direct behest of a foreign government, APT41 has been seen conducting financially motivated attacks. This group in particular really is kind of admirable for their hustle. During the day, they act on behalf of the Chinese state government. They're conducting intrusions, targeting a lot of high-profile espionage targets. They've gone after insurance, they've gone after telecoms. They're very, very talented at doing something that we call swimming upstream, meaning going up the kind of telecommunications provider network and ladder in order to enable long-lasting and far-reaching surveillance campaigns. However, once they clock out of their day job, we have actually seen them conduct really interesting attacks that have really only financial gain. It seems that in their off hours, they're actually moonlighting as kind of a cybercrime group. This caused a lot of trouble for us when we were conducting the initial attribution efforts, and it was really one of the things that raised a lot of interest when we started talking about APT41 publicly. This campaign that we were tracking had APT41 doing a lot of really interesting things. They were targeting state governments across about 6 different states and really going after different organizations within those state governments, moving around between different departments, doing some interesting kind of back-end stuff, and we really couldn't figure out why they were doing it for quite some time. But we started to get a better idea of what their purpose was by tracking these campaigns. One of the first examples that we got was our managed defense team was actually able to find an active APT41 campaign targeting a state government. We were able to isolate it, identify it, and kick them off the network. And then 2 weeks later, they came right back. And in coming back, they burned a new 0 day that they had, using it for the very first time. So, really interesting fact number 1. Really interesting fact number 2, one of the things that APT41 has gotten really, really good at, and Chinese espionage actors have gotten really good at over the past couple of years, is moving exceptionally quickly in adopting new techniques and new vulnerabilities. I'm sure everybody in this room has chronic migraines from Log4j. For those of you who don't, you're lucky, but Log4j was a huge, huge, huge risk vulnerability that was really first identified last year, has still been kind of a problem as time has gone on, will likely be a problem as long as people use computers. One of the things that we saw APT41 do was that within hours of the original announcement by Apache, we started to see Log4j be abused by APT41 to target victims in this campaign. All of which is to say that this is an example of a very sophisticated, very dangerous, very capable and mature actor targeting state and local governments, which are the election administrators. However, during the entirety of this campaign, so 9 months, we saw no evidence that they had any interest in elections at all. In fact, it seems that this campaign, in part, was intended to do something as really kind of mundane as fraud. They were actually filing unemployment returns on behalf of people and collecting their unemployment checks. This example of people targeting these outer or middle rung of the attack surface of elections is fascinating to see in action. But there are other risks that we have to consider when we talk about this kind of election administration. and especially the election administrators. And this is where ransomware starts to show up. Everyone knows ransomware has been a problem. What they probably don't know is that when ransomware first started coming on the scene, they were actually very, very specifically targeting, in some cases, state governments. We think it's because state governments really kind of hit their sweet spot of having a lot of money, having not a lot of that money spent on security, and not being able to do their job and then getting yelled at by their constituents if they didn't get their stuff working again. We have a really good example of ransomware impacting elections actually that came on October 7th of 2020, about a month before the 2020 presidential election. There was a ransomware attack on Georgia Hall County governments. And these attacks disabled a database that were used to verify voter signatures when authenticating absentee ballots. So ultimately, this attack could have disrupted the elections in this one particular county. Thankfully, the people who were in charge of elections in that county were able to move really quick. They were able to establish a way to bypass this particular weakness in their election process, and they were able to hand verify a lot of the signatures that they needed to verify to make sure the absentee ballots got counted. This is an attack that came really opportunistically, we think. It was conducted by Doppelpaymer, which is one of a myriad of different ransomware groups that have come and gone in the past couple of years. But it speaks really to the weakness of election administrators. If they don't have this shorn up, if they don't have their election security set up correctly and really ideally kind of segmented from the rest of their entire organization, there is a risk of ransomware actors being able to do exactly what we've seen them do. Hit a target that is desperately in need of being able to operate at max capacity precisely when they're needed most. We saw this happen very, very frequently with ransomware actors targeting healthcare during the coronavirus pandemic. That was really when the first allegations came of ransomware directly causing a human death. If you may have heard that report that happened in Germany. This kind of attack is something we see from ransomware actors all the time, and there's no reason to think that they won't target and take advantage of the opportunistic happening that's coming along in the next couple of weeks. That being said, again, the evidence that we have that ransomware has impacted elections is mitigated. Extraordinarily low impact, except for this one attack, and in our expert opinion, really not something that we expect to be a huge disruptor to the core integrity of elections. That brings us really to our outer rim here. This outer rim, as I said when we started, really has to do with the conversation and perception of elections. You have political parties and campaigns, you have social media platforms, donor groups, news organizations, anyone who has a massive voice but no real ability to reach out and touch voter integrity or the integrity of elections themselves. These kinds of attacks that we see targeting this outer rim really have to do with I/O, influence operations that we at Mandiant have tracked generally from foreign adversaries or foreign adversaries serving the interest of foreign governments. We have already seen movement by some actors who have conducted I/O starting to take advantage of and target the actual elections. We've seen some shifts in the narrative that they've been using. This is a really good breakdown of how we talk about I/O, but for the most part, all you need to know is that I/O is a campaign or an operation that is intending to push some kind of narrative across generally social media. There's a lot of different ways that these can happen, but Lee is the expert and I'm going to let him go really into depth on that. All I'm going to say is that we have seen, as I said, 3 individual campaigns already pivot to start targeting the elections in their messaging. And there is one group in particular that I think is most interesting, which is called Dragon Bridge. For those of you who haven't heard, Dragon Bridge is a pro-Chinese disinformation or influence operation. They've been doing a lot of really interesting stuff over the past couple of years, but one of the things that I first noticed that really made me pay attention to them was a recent campaign this year that really did a lot of things I hadn't seen in I/O before. What was interesting about this is that the Dragon Bridge campaign started posing as local residents of a place in Texas called Linus and a certain few other places around kind of North America. And they started posing as local residents because they were trying to really stir up grassroots opposition to a rare earth refining and mining operation that was taking place kind of across the entirety of North America. What's fascinating to me about this is that this is the first time I have seen Dragon Bridge or any IO group directly target really financially motivated activity. It seems that they're trying to do this in order to support probably China's kind of dominance in the rare earth mining and refining efforts. We know that China has a very significant focus on rare earth. We know that it's part of what feeds their semiconductor production, all of the other high-tech stuff that they do. Dragon Bridge is really noteworthy. They've adopted a few new techniques that are worth paying attention to. But again, at the end of the day, their impact and the impact of most foreign or pro-foreign IO campaigns really has been very limited in swaying American domestic elections. That being said, there is one thing that we haven't really talked about, and I want Lee to come up and really give his presentation because he is the expert on exactly what is called disinformation, and he'll explain what that means as compared to information operations. So thank you very much, and we'll be back in a minute.
Thanks, Andrew. Can you hear me? Mike, good. Thanks, Andrew. I think you're overselling the expertise a little bit there, so I'll try to live up to it. My name is Lee Foster. I'm the Senior Vice President of a company called Alethea Group that specializes in tracking and mitigating disinformation. I've been at Alethea Group for a little over a year now. Prior to that, I spent 7 years at Mandiant, where I was Director of Information Operations Analysis. So very familiar with all of the work that Andrew has referenced here. I'm going to spend my time talking to you specifically about the disinformation threat to the upcoming midterms. And I want to begin with a premise. It may be bold in some circumstances, compared to what a lot of people have been saying over the past few years as it pertains to disinformation. But that is domestic disinformation and real individuals, not foreign state information operations and inauthentic personas that categorize them, present the biggest disinformation risk to the upcoming midterms. That's not to say that we don't see foreign and suspected foreign influence activity discussing the elections. Andrew mentioned Dragon Bridge briefly just now, also known as Spamouflage Dragon. We've been tracking them, discussing the midterms, or what we say here, suspected Spamouflage Dragon Bridge. I say suspected because the boundaries for attribution of Dragon Bridge Spamouflage have become very murky over the past 3 or so years since it was first discovered. We could have a whole other presentation about that, but feel free to ask questions later on that. But they're a great example of how foreign activity primarily replicates and amplifies false and misleading narratives that originate here within the US. And so what have we been seeing in the Dragon Bridge context? Inauthentic social media accounts, presenting as Americans, pushing content on both sides of the political aisle, or trying to disparage, quite virulently, both sides of the political aisle. Presenting as being in states like Texas, as you mentioned, Florida, and so on. And really regurgitating narratives, content about election fraud, big lie, and so on, that you hear a lot about here domestically. They have been kind of alluding to some QAnon-aligned conspiracy theories as well in some of these posts. Think about things like accusations of child grooming, trafficking, and so on that are really prominent within those communities. And this kind of replication and amplification of domestic narratives is common among kind of the foreign actors pushing midterm-related content. Andrew skipped his slide. I did preview it earlier, but there was one in there that also mentioned a couple of other cases, right? NABC is a kind of a Russian-affiliated operation, and Even Politic, a Iranian operation. And one of the things that Andrew had highlighted in that slide, which I previewed, is that they were also kind of taking narratives and content that's already playing out here. So it's not that they're kind of going out and creating this information environment, they're merely seizing upon what already exists. So that's on the kind of foreign IO side. I also mentioned real people, real individuals engaging in this kind of activity. And here's a great example that me and my team worked and was reported on last week. A series of YouTube channels operated by real people, their personalities. There's no evidence to suggest that they're in any way coordinating with each other, necessarily even know of each other. But they're a great example of just the complexity of the disinformation ecosystem that we find ourselves in now. So what were they doing? They're sourcing election-related narratives, accusations of fraud and so on, that the 2020 elections were stolen. They're sourcing them from alternative media outlets and sources here in the US. Then they're translating those into Spanish, kind of creating these high production broadcasts of them and pushing them back out into the world, reaching Latin American audiences and Spanish-speaking audiences here in the US as well. On top of that, they've also been regurgitating foreign state media that has themselves been regurgitating these narratives pushed by alternative media networks here in the US. A classic example being RT en Español. They're taking Russian state media, the Spanish translations of that, and then reporting that as fact back into these Spanish-speaking audiences. While we can't know, obviously, the entirety of their motivations, there does seem to be a seeming financial motivation there. The YouTube ads were being monetized. There were links to things like Patreon accounts and donation pages so that these channels' supporters could donate money directly to these personalities. And collectively, well, even individually, some of them, but collectively, they have hundreds of thousands of subscribers and millions of views. Like, this is a big thing. The focus study we did here was 7 YouTube channels. You're talking about millions of views, hundreds of thousands of subscribers. It's a huge, huge issue. What do these narratives look like? There are a lot of the same old things we've been hearing about for the past few years. The elections here suffer from extensive fraud. The 2020 presidential election was stolen. You may have heard of this movement, Stop the Steal, right? It's this kind of proactive attempt to try to prevent the Democratic Party from stealing all of the elections here in the US. And so we're seeing the recycling of these kind of narratives. We're seeing a recycling of narratives claiming voting machine irregularities, or that voting machine producers are manipulating results in concert with state election officials. Dominion voting systems is obviously a famous example of this. It's played out quite prominently in national media. But there are others as well, Smartmatic, now Conic as well, other firms like this that are being referenced. Now, these narratives are being recycled, but with new evolutions. Something we recently reported on is accusations that Dominion voting systems and Smartmatic were used in the recent Brazilian presidential elections to sway the results of that election. Absolutely factually untrue. Dominion voting systems and Smartmatic are not used in Brazil's elections at all, right? This is purely made up. We're seeing that circulating in Portuguese. There's that organic traction within Brazil itself. But what's even more interesting here is there's a lot of prominent US-based people pushing this narrative and then tying it into this claim that this is a precursor to what we're going to see in the 2022 midterms here. So they're using these foreign elections to line up narratives that we know are going to play out, in the upcoming elections very soon. Why do I take this so seriously? Why do I flag this? Why do me and Andrew think that disinformation is the most important threat to the elections currently? It's because election disinformation and misinformation is motivating physical, real-world mobilization. It is having a material effect. What does that look like? There's been accusations that drop boxes for mail-in ballots are being stuffed by mules with fake votes to try to sway elections. And so there are now citizen stakeout surveillance movements being set up to actively monitor these drop boxes to see if, in fact, people are coming and stuffing, these so-called mules are coming and stuffing these ballot boxes with votes. Just this week, a prominent individual in this kind of movement splashed up on social media. Some random guy who was at a ballot drop box, his picture on social media, making these claims that he was engaging in some sort of fraudulent behavior as it pertained to the election. Now, there are obviously a lot of gray areas around here, various state laws around, what you can and can't do as it pertains to monitoring election stations, ballot drop boxes, and so on. What's interesting in this is in these conversations, we are seeing active discussions about interdicting any attempts or perceived attempts to stuff these boxes. So conversations about make sure you follow that person home, find out who they are, where they live, and so on, right? Which goes well beyond what would constitute any legitimate monitoring activity. We see harassment and intimidation of elections officials and poll workers. There's been some public reporting about some elections officials quite concerned for their safety in the upcoming elections because of the kind of visceral reaction, adherence to some of these false narratives have been having towards them. Similar to the drop boxes, efforts to organize surveillance of voting sites. Perfectly legal for the most part, but depends on how, when they're doing it. And obviously this does open up doors for potential intimidation and kind of, voters feeling like, they can't go out and vote, in confidence. We're seeing active efforts by prominent influencers within conspiracy communities to get specific people to staff elections, to actually get inside, be a poll worker, become an election official, because they're of the belief that these elections are being stolen, so they need somebody on their side, on the inside, to prevent that from happening. We've recently been seeing kind of conversations involving attempts to organize coalitions of state elections officials to overturn results. There's a prominent influencer within the QAnon community who is trying to align a number of secretaries of states across different states who have indicated they'd be willing to overturn votes if there were allegations of voter fraud. So there's active organization and communication kind of happening around these individuals as well. And then I've put insider threats as a kind of question mark there. Andrew brought up the insider threat concept earlier, referenced a case. There's been a case where an elections official invited a uncleared third party to come and support an audit of an election machine, ended up taking data that was then given to someone. There's a whole criminal case around that now, but that from the outside appears to have been driven by these narratives and these worries that the elections are being stolen. And so I put a question mark here. Are these kind of narratives going to motivate individuals to take it upon themselves to try and fix a problem for which there is no evidence of, and in the process actively end up undermining the elections themselves? That's not to say all hope is lost, and there are definitely things that elections officials can and should be doing to prepare for this, to get ahead of these narratives. I put some examples here of things I actively anticipate we're going to see, either in the run-up to the election. Some of them are being kind of preceded now, like the voting machine narratives that I referenced earlier, and some that are going to really emerge on election night and the days after. Allegations against election software companies and voting machine manufacturers engaging in voter fraud. I've mentioned Dominion Voting, Smartmatic, Conic. Recently, their CEO was charged with storing data, voter data on servers in China. And so that's now feeding into, narratives that therefore there must be some sort of kind of fraud going on in the conduct of the elections themselves. Anticipate seeing accusations of collusion against elections officials, that they're working in concert to steal the elections, either with each other, with voting machine providers, and so on. Late night ballot drops on election night. We've seen this, in previous elections. I've got this kind of under a couple of bullets here in slightly different ways. Number one, demographic realities suggest that, cities take a lot longer to count their votes on election night, and so those results come in a lot later than rural counties. And so what will happen is it may look like a candidate's leading up until X time, and then suddenly the lead switches. And people use that to suggest that therefore there's some sort of artificial kind of interference going on here, that fake votes are being dumped into the counts to sway the lead. So there's that kind of demographic influence of that. There's also the mail-in ballots component of this as well. Some states, I believe Pennsylvania, can't count mail-in ballots until after the polls close. And so again, once they then start getting counted, you see these large numbers suddenly get, put into the vote totals. We may well see premature declarations of victory from various candidates, right? Which is only going to confuse the scenario. I don't know how closely some of you are monitoring a lot of the state races, but they're pretty vitriolic. They're pretty intense, and it wouldn't surprise me if we see some candidates come out and kind of declare victory prematurely. And then if you're an elections official, what are you going to do about that, right? That's going to create all sorts of kind of problems for you from a messaging and trust perspective. And then finally, I put under here, how will you respond when your precincts experience the inevitable process hiccups or technical glitches? I'm not sure if I can remember an election where something hasn't happened, a power cut, a machine stopped working for whatever reason, long lines, or people got put in the wrong line, or whatever it may be. All of these things will get picked up and used to feed conspiratorial narratives that there is wide-scale election fraud going on. And so if you're an election official, what are you doing to prepare for that? How are you thinking about those scenarios? How are you preparing your messaging? How are you educating your electorates even prior to election day so that they don't fall susceptible to these kind of narratives? So that's kind of the kind of overarching point I wanted to make today. I know we've got 7-ish minutes here for questions from me and Andrew as well. So I guess, Andrew, if you want to come up, and we'll happily take questions.
We're trusted to make our own selection. Hi, go ahead.
So I am an American living abroad. I live in Toronto, but I am able to vote in the States because that is the rules. And there are about 600,000 Americans living abroad, and most of the efforts to get them to vote are all volunteer-led. And I'm not sure how much you have insight into disinformation, misinformation campaigns to those citizens who may not necessarily know how to get a ballot. I volunteer to help get them ballots, so I understand it's a very complex and strange process. So do you have insight into if there are threat groups looking to target those individuals as well? Is it mostly just all kind of domestic and within these other kind of campaigns? And kind of how do you factor internationally living Americans into this whole process?
So I don't have specific insight into targeting of them specifically, but it does jog my memory, and Andrew, correct me if I'm wrong on this, of some activity back in 2020, I believe, that involved threat actors abusing that system to try to demonstrate that there's election fraud. And what they did is, I think it was military absentee voting systems. They went on to register for ballots, and they were filming themselves do this on screen, right? And then they'd fill in the names of dead people from whatever, and they put it in, they put these things into this thing, and all that does is send you a ballot. But they were filming it and presenting it as, here are dead people voting, and here's how you do it. And so they were abusing that registration system to make it look like, absentee voters are kind of this ripe avenue for election fraud. So, it's tangential to your question. I haven't seen specific targeting, of messaging against those, but it's something I think that's important to flag, right? It's this kind of abuse of these systems to present a narrative that isn't true.
Yeah, and it's definitely, that's when we talk about the Mandiant approach to looking at election security, we talk about kind of what Kevin was talking about yesterday, right? We talk about attacks on confidence. That's really what the core of the election threats that we've seen have been. Underscoring how you can chip away at the confidence that individuals have in the electoral process really is how you topple democracy, really. You make people stop believing that they can have some sort of voice or some sort of vote. So that kind of complication really is exactly, when it's established and built out, it's built by people who don't have security in mind. And really, when you're talking about security in systems like that, security comes from simplicity. The more simple that process is to enable voters to go out and say, I'm living abroad, I can vote, what's the easiest way for me to do it? There should be an easy kind of back-feeding loop into that makes it very easy for everyone who wants to vote who can, and very clear that if you can't vote, you're not going to be able to. And this is the kind of thing that we see all the time in every kind of realm of security. When we talk about designing with security in mind or security in engineering, there's this security-led intelligence is kind of a buzzword, but it really is this kind of development that we need to come back and talk to people in the government, talk to people who do this kind of stuff and say, look, if you have a process, you need to understand that it can be attacked and build that process in a way that it is less likely to be attacked. We're never going to stop attacks in particular, but that kind of forward-leaning thing, like Lee is saying, is ripe for precisely what he's described, which is a disinformation campaign. These people weren't, these attackers weren't voting under the names of dead people. They were just requesting a ballot. We don't have no insight from anything that they videoed that there was any use of that ballot as a legitimate vote in the elections, just that they could do something that they probably shouldn't have been allowed to do. So I hope that answers your question.
I think so. It's really complex, and I've been living abroad for 12 years now, so it's been a fun adventure trying to figure out this whole process.
And it's people like you that we really need to actually be kind of outspoken about that and having those conversations and saying, look, hey, American Embassy, this could work a lot better. I mean, we're 18 miles away from people in certain places and we still can't vote. So yeah, it's a fascinating kind of example. But any other questions? Yeah.
Given that Russia is kind of spread thin in the information operations space right now, do you foresee China filling that space? And if so, what kind of narratives do you see them amplifying?
I'll take this one to start with. So 2022 has been fun. I think everybody can agree. What we're seeing right now is Russia, you're absolutely right, is spread thin in every sense of the word. Iran as well, not having the best year. China as well is undergoing an enormous amount of strain, both internally and externally. They're trying to juggle a lot of balls right now. I think there is a chance from what we have seen at Mandiant, there's definitely an opportunity for China to step in and start doing more than they were. I think what we're seeing right now is that despite how fast, from my perspective, Dragon Bridge has been evolving and some of the other I/O has been evolving, and really the limited impact that they've still had on exactly impacting really anything but elections in particular is probably would lead me to hedge my bet they're going to be more effective rather than they were in the past couple of years. We've seen the big examples, I think, of disinformation affecting elections. Obviously, the big one is 2016. We had the intrusion led by parts of the GRU that came in and targeted the Democratic National Committee. There were allegations of involvement of whether it was GRU or FSB. They stole a bunch of information, fed it to WikiLeaks under some sort of broad spectrum, very hastily constructed persona. That got picked up and was spread out into the ether. And whether it moved polls or not, we're not really sure. The point, though, is that really is kind of from our perspective, the most dangerous possible scenario of a long-term intrusion that gains, whether it's something actually damaging or not, it's just sensitive and complicated. And then that can be spun by, whoever they have, whatever information assets they have. China certainly has the capacity to do long-term intrusions like that. They certainly have the capacity to target potentially sensitive information and leak it under some sort of pretense. Whether they're going to or not, I mean, we're really up against the wire. I don't know how big they are in procrastination, but it's going to be hard to move the needle at this point. But yeah, Lee, if you have anything you want to cover on that.
I referenced some work on that slide there, potential Dragon Bridge, right? It's a potential because of the murky attribution nature of pro-China IO right now. So let me preface this entire answer with, if that is China, it does suggest an evolution in their willingness to dip their toes deeper and deeper into domestic US politics. They started originally as kind of, against the Hong Kong protests, moved into this broader geopolitical space of let's just disparage the US, kind of make China look really good, a lot of kind of Belt and Road Initiative type stuff. And then over time, they've been dipping their toes deeper and deeper into the domestic space. So that would suggest, if it is China, an evolution at least there in intent. The activity did not get any traction, typical of Dragon Bridge, and
right.
we notified social media and they took it down, before it even had a chance, but frankly, I don't think it would have got a chance anyway to gain traction. So I don't know if there's an effectiveness question there. What I will say, as it pertains to your question though, this isn't a saturated market, and it's completely irrelevant what Russia is doing as to whether China chooses to step in and engage more in that space, right? And I think the evolution we're seeing Chinese I/O is them figuring out, how far they want to push the envelope. And I don't think, Russia being kind of distracted with Ukraine necessarily kind of creates this opening for them to come in and fill, because they could have done that anyway if they had the willingness to do so, even when Russia was more active. So I don't think that changes that overall landscape, and we want to think kind of more individually and independently about, well, what is shaping China's decision to engage in this activity itself? And that comes down to its relations with the US rather than what Russia is doing.
I think we're at time, but I won't speak for Lee in case he wants to go eat lunch, but I will be out kind of hanging around if anybody wants to come and ask more questions. Thank you all very much for coming out. We really appreciate it. Thanks for coming to mWISE, and we will see you sometime soon. Thanks very much.
Okay.